Alright, here we go, first video of the year. This particular project was designed for a friend of mine who gave me the simple prompt of gnome, gnome dwelling, or gnome mobile. I decided to combine the three and make a gnome mobile home on the back of a deer. The saddle went through a couple of different ideas, but eventually I came up with this shack design as seen here. However, before anything was constructed, I had to make myself a gnome. The gnome itself is made of a couple of beads, and his hat is a trimmed down superglue cap. I used a bit of fabric to cover the bead body and made it look like he was wearing a cloak, which is also my excuse for not having to make legs or arms. The beard is a small section of cotton ball and was painstakingly attached to the head with glue. Most of this process wasn't filmed because it was me fiddling with cotton ball for like a half an hour. Since having an eyeless gnome didn't look quite right, I took some of this ball chain and used two of the orbs as a pair of eyes. Now, instead of eyeless and creepy, he's got the crazy eye. I can't sculpt animals, but I can buy them. The basic thought is to use this green craft foam as a base for the saddle. Once it was cut to shape, I hot glued it straight to the back of the deer. There was also a strap that went underneath the body so that it looked more realistic. The deck that the shack will sit on was made of strips of balsa wood. Before these were added, I made sure to paint the saddle. These two sticks will be structural support for the actual deck. And for some added detail, I wrapped each end of the bundle in string to look like they were tied together. The walls of the shack were made of more strips of balsa wood, and were glued to sections of cardstock, which will help with stability. These wall sections were trimmed down and glued together with some strips of cardboard for the roof. Since the shack hung over the back of the deck, I extended the floor and added some additional support beams underneath. Roof shingles were made of cardboard cut with patterned scissors and were built up in layers. The majority of the painting was just building up various layers of brown on all of the wooden sections. The roof tiles were painted a bright red, and a small amount of olive green was added as moss or a buildup of algae. Presumably our gnome does live in the woods, so it would make sense to have some greenery on it. In the doorway, I added a small rug, which was a pattern I printed off on printer paper and glued to a piece of cardstock. Around the bottom of the saddle, I added some tassels made of small strips of paper. Once the structure was attached to the saddle, I added some additional straps connecting the two. Between the antlers, I tied a section of string to use as a clothesline, where I hung another patterned rug and another smaller towel or something. A small lantern was made and hung off the back of the shack as well. Around the deer's schnoz, I added a piece of foam for a harness. This will be added to later. The final step was building and attaching a small ladder to one side. As usual, the base was a section of foam glued to a piece of wood and carved to shape. You may notice three sort of concave areas in the foam. These will become puddles later on. After covering the foam in spackle, I painted it to look like mud. On the high points of the ground, I added grass part 1. Grass part 2 will be coming soon. The three concave areas were filled with this realistic resin water, and once it cures, it'll form our puddles. After it did, and before I attached the deer, I painted the sides of the wood base black. The deer received a piece of wire in one of its legs to help with attaching it to the base, and was then put in its final spot. A small branch and grass part 2, told you it was coming soon, were also added for some extra detail. You may also notice that the rest of the harness and reins have been installed. And here it is in its completed state. This was probably one of my favorite projects so far, and I do plan on doing some more fantasy-based dioramas in the future. More pictures of the completed piece will be up on my Instagram if you'd like to check them out, and hopefully you've enjoyed watching. I'll see you in the next one. Have a good rest of your day.